Every gardener knows the waiting game of composting. You layer grass clippings, leaves, and scraps, then turn and water the pile, only to find months later it's still halfway there. Composting works, but it's slow, and in our rush to get that dark, rich humus, we often reach for modern shortcuts. But here's the surprising truth. Our grandparents and great-grandparents already had a composting hack that works faster than most additives sold today. It didn't come from a bag at the store, it came from their backyards, using materials so ordinary we've nearly forgotten them. The method is simple, but the results are powerful, turning sluggish piles into steaming engines of decay in a matter of days. This forgotten backyard method revolves around a practice called trench layering, sometimes known as the compost pit or soil layer method. Long before plastic bins and commercial accelerators, gardeners dug shallow trenches right in the soil, layered kitchen waste, grass, and leaves, and then capped it all with a blanket of old soil. Unlike surface piles, which lose moisture and require constant attention, this buried layering system harnesses nature's own design. It keeps heat steady, locks in moisture, draws in worms, and accelerates breakdown in a way that surprises even modern gardeners. Why compost piles slow down? Before looking at why trench layering works so well, it helps to understand why the standard pile often slows to a crawl. A heap sitting above ground is vulnerable to drying out. Microbes thrive in moist, warm, balanced environments, but once the outer layers of a compost pile lose moisture or airflow, decomposition stalls. Turning helps, but it also interrupts the heat cycle, which microbes need to digest tough materials. Too much carbon from leaves or too much nitrogen from grass can also tip the balance, leaving a pile either sluggish and dry or, smelly and slimy. This is why, a lot of gardeners end up turning to amendments like sugar molasses or even commercial inoculants. These do work, but honestly, they're only addressing symptoms, not really the core issue. The forgotten backyard method just sidesteps the problem entirely by shifting composting from above-ground exposure to below-ground balance. So, how does the forgotten backyard method work? Well, the trench layering method is deceptively simple. Instead of piling materials above ground, you just dig a shallow trench or pit, usually about a foot deep, either right in your garden bed or nearby. Then, kitchen scraps, garden weeds, and grass clippings are added in thin layers, followed by a little scattering of dry leaves or shredded paper. Each layer gets capped off with a thin coating of soil from the trench itself. This layering continues until the trench is filled, then the whole thing is sealed up with several inches of soil. What happens next is honestly pretty remarkable. The buried organic matter creates this moist, oxygen-rich environment where microbes can really flourish. Unlike surface piles, where moisture just evaporates, the soil cap locks it all in. The contact with the surrounding soil means earthworms and beneficial insects find the organic layers super quickly. Microbes multiply even faster because the sugars and proteins in the fresh scraps aren't exposed to air, where they dry out or attract pests. Instead, they're preserved in the perfect underground incubator. Within just a few weeks, those layers collapse into a humus-like material, feeding the soil above. Worm tunnels spread through, aerating everything naturally, while the heat generated underground really speeds up the breakdown, but never gets too extreme. The microbial advantage? Yeah, that's what really makes trench layering such a supercharger. Compost microbes are basically everywhere, in soil, on leaves, even floating around in the air, but, they need the right conditions to really thrive. The soil cap actually acts like a microbial inoculant, seeding the organic layers with billions of decomposers instantly. Fungi, in particular, really benefit from this system. In a typical compost pile, fungi can be disrupted by turning or by too much heat. But underground fungal hyphae spread uninterrupted, weaving their way through layers of leaves and stalks, breaking down lignin and cellulose. This totally speeds up the breakdown of those tougher materials, which usually take months to decompose above ground. And hey, there's another advantage, the nitrogen cycle. In piles, nitrogen gases can escape into the air as ammonia, which is why a poorly balanced heap smells so bad. But underground, the soil layer traps much of this nitrogen, holding it in place for microbes and eventually for plants. The result? Less odor, less nutrient loss, and a much richer finished product. Worms, The secret workers. One of the biggest reasons this forgotten method works so well is its natural invitation to earthworms. Worms are shy about exposed piles, often avoiding the heat and dryness. But in buried trenches, they move in almost immediately. They consume softened scraps, digest them into worm castings, and in doing so accelerate the transformation into humus. This creates a living compost system, not just a passive decomposition. Instead of waiting months for a pile to break down before using it, trench layering delivers steady fertility to the soil above as the worms and microbes process the buried matter. In effect, you're feeding the soil directly rather than creating compost separately and hauling it back later. So, let's talk about how you can actually use this method in your own garden. First, pick a garden bed that could use a little organic boost, or maybe an area where you plan to plant something in the future. You'll want to dig a trench about a foot deep and, make it wide enough to handle all your kitchen scraps for the week. Place a thin layer of those scraps right at the bottom, then cover them with a handful of dry material and sprinkle a thin layer of soil on top. Just keep repeating those layers, scraps, dry material, soil, until you're out of scraps. When you're done, seal up the trench with about 3 or 4 inches of soil. Give it a light watering to settle everything in and, well, that's it, just leave it be. Over the next several weeks, you'll notice the soil starting to sink a bit as all that buried matter breaks down. The surface will look like any ordinary garden bed, but underneath, worms and microbes are working full-time. After about 6 to 8 weeks, the trench is fully incorporated into the soil, and you'll have this rich strip of fertility that's just perfect for planting. You can actually rotate this method across your beds, creating little underground compost banks that keep feeding your garden all year round. And unlike traditional compost piles that need space, turning, and waiting, this method quietly builds up your soil's fertility right where you need it, with almost no extra effort. Now you might be wondering, why did people stop using this method if it works so well? Honestly, the shift happened mostly in the mid-20th century, when cities grew, backyard space shrank, and chemical fertilizers promised those instant results. Composting kind of moved into bins, for the sake of convenience and keeping things tidy. But somewhere along the way we forgot that the soil itself is actually the best composting vessel we have. So, reviving trench layering today is not just about nostalgia. Honestly, it's about efficiency, sustainability, and working with natural processes instead of against them. It actually solves the biggest problems of modern composting: odor, pests, dryness, and slowness, without requiring any extra tools or products. It's free, simple, and surprisingly powerful. The forgotten backyard method of trench layering isn't just a clever trick. It's really a return to common sense. By letting the soil itself act as the compost bin, gardeners create a microenvironment that, supercharges decomposition, invites worms, traps nutrients, and produces fertile humus a whole lot faster than above-ground piles. It works equally well in small spaces and larger gardens, making it honestly one of the most practical and accessible composting methods for modern times. If you want to take your composting to the next level, don't just pile your scraps, bury them strategically. Let the soil do the work, and you'll see results that, really rival the best bins or accelerators. If this deep dive into forgotten composting methods gave you some fresh ideas, make sure to subscribe to Hydro Haven for more soil building insights. Share this video with a friend who struggles with composting, and together let's bring back the methods that make soil come alive.